Welcome to JPod. This is a podcast on journalists and journalism. My name is Krishna Prasad and it's great to have you here. 20 years ago, Web 2.0 ushered in the world of social media. It was free, it was fast, it was fun. Anybody with a phone could take part, and almost everyone did. It instantly connected friends, families, and communities. And major political events like the Arab Spring in Egypt briefly showed the potential of the technology as a liberator of the oppressed, the voice of the voiceless. But in the last decade, social media platforms like Facebook have increasingly become the very opposite of what they were expected to be. Instead of expanding our worldview, their algorithms have made us inward looking. Instead of bringing people together, they are dividing societies apart with hatred. Instead of informing us of the real, they have become the fountain of fake. Hundreds have died across the world over what they saw or read on Facebook and what they received and forwarded on WhatsApp, which is also owned by Facebook. And instead of helping democracies, the tech platforms have become a tool of authoritarians from the United States to Brazil, from Sri Lanka to Myanmar. India is no exception. Facebook's increasingly shady role in Indian politics, hunting with the majoritarian hounds and fueling the communal fires, had been blazingly apparent for years. But it took a devastating expose in the Wall Street Journal last month to reveal the extent. Over the last 20 days, WSJ and Time magazine have done 3 stories revealing the proactive and partisan role played by Facebook's chief India lobbyist Ankhi Das in allowing hate speech on the platform to the advantage of the BJP. The stories have also exposed how deeply and personally she was invested in the Narendra Modi election campaign while disparaging the opposition. Yet, except one story in the Indian Express, almost no Indian media outlet has been interested in drilling into such a gold mine. My guest today on JPod is a journalist who has been examining the telltale marks left by Facebook with a forensic attention to detail. Kunal Purohit is an independent journalist based in Mumbai who's been looking at the role of social media platforms in the rise of Hindu nationalism and Hindutva hate crimes. A recipient of the Ramnath Goenka Excellence in Journalism Award and the Statesman Award for Rural Journalism, Kunal's work now appears in publications ranging from the South China Morning Post to Foreign Policy. In this episode of JPod, Kunal Purohit discusses the implications of the WSJ expose and what young journalists can do to keep the needle moving. Hi Kunal, good morning and thank you very much for joining me on this podcast. And I hope you've been doing well.
Good morning, Krishna. Thank you so much for inviting me to your podcast. I must say that I have been listening to episodes of the podcast, and I am just very grateful that someone like you is doing this for Indian journalism. You know, where you're constantly talking to journalists and trying to get to the depth of stories that the mainstream media often doesn't. So thank you for that.
Kunal, Facebook's role in distorting democracies has been apparent for quite some time now. But it seems to have taken the 2016 election of Donald Trump for the world to really wake up as to what platforms like Facebook were really doing to our societies, to our democracies, and so on and so forth. What was your first reaction when you saw the Wall Street Journal report on India, the BJP, Facebook, and Ankhi Das?
You know, I've been tracking both Facebook and WhatsApp especially, and you know, understanding how especially the right wing is using these platforms to spread the message and you know, to control the narrative in so many ways, right? Often all of this is, you know, beyond the radar of all of our sort of social profiles, because you know, we don't often deep you know, sort of do a deep dive into these platforms and these networks. And I had seen that you know, like I mean, religious hate flourishes on both of these platforms, Facebook and WhatsApp. And obviously, you know, in my reporting, I've brought that out at various points, you know, especially on WhatsApp. When I did see that in this context, when I did see that, you know, Wall Street Journal piece, I mean, my first reaction was like, God, okay. So this is, this hunch that I had carried, like so many of us did. This suspicion that I had sort of carried, is somewhat, found its confirmation, right? That there is some sort of a soft peddling by Facebook India, especially towards the BJP and towards elements of the BJP. And as someone who follows the content so closely, I've seen how the soft peddling works and what it results in. But here was a confirmation, and I hold the Wall Street Journal story in great regard. So I would say that here's in some sense a confirmation that Facebook has been proactively trying to be soft on BJP, and commercial interests are one aspect of why they want to be soft on the BJP.
Wall Street Journal has done two stories so far, spread over 15 days. And the first WSJ report spoke of Ankhi Das fearing, quote unquote, a political fallout if one of the BJP members, T. Raja Singh's posts were removed. So was this all about politics or was this about business, as you can see?
So, Krishna, I mean, my sense is this, right? Facebook is this, multi-million dollar corporation. It obviously has operations across the world. I don't necessarily think Facebook, is an evil, ideologically driven platform which is trying to promote one ideology. But I think at the same time, I think it's very clearly a platform or a company which will only look at profit, and will look at very little apart from its own interests and its own profits, right? At this point, and Krishna, you're a better person to talk about this than I do. Almost every media organization, of some repute in India has tilted towards, the right, and has tilted towards the ruling dispensation. I don't necessarily think they all believe in the ideology. I think it's just very convenient. I mean, capitalism, capitalism is sort of making the best of exactly such a moment where one ideology and affiliations and an alignment towards the ideology will benefit you commercially at this point, profusely. Just take the example of Times of India, for instance, right? It also used to run Mirror Now under Faye D'Souza, which some would say was a very liberal avatar of the Times, and people liked watching it, took on the right issues. But it also runs Times Now, right? One of the other examples is the Anand Bazar Patrika. It runs the Telegraph in Calcutta, but it also runs ABP channels, which do some of the most brazen, pro-ruling party and pro-ruling dispensation stories. So this is just convenient at this point, Krishna. And in the same league, I must say that my suspicion is that Facebook doesn't really care as much for the ideology. Its officials might be inclined towards the BJP, but I don't think that would drive the decisions of the corporation in itself. I think they've realized that the way to do business here, that the way to do, to expand its reach is to be closely aligned to the ruling dispensation, is to be closely aligned to the BJP, favor it in whatever way it can, while safeguarding its own interests legally as well, and then try and reap the benefits of it. So, the fact that Facebook officials like Ankhi Das, like even Shivnath Tukral, who has worked with the Modi campaign before, as the latest WSJ story also points out, these are just very clever choices, in my opinion, that have been made by Facebook. Once a corporation knows that it has to do business with one entity, you'll obviously try and, get people who are closer to that entity or who are aligned to the entity to, liaison between your corporation and that entity. And that's exactly what Facebook has tried to do with Ankhi Das and the likes of Shivnath Tukral when it comes to doing business with the BJP. They've chosen people who either have had previous experience of how to deal with the BJP, or, much worse, who are ideologically inclined towards the BJP. And I think that is what is at work here. I don't think necessarily that this is an ideological slant. I feel like if the Congress were to be in power right now, Facebook would do what it has to do in terms of trying to, cozy up to the ruling dispensation headed by the Congress?
The reason I asked you whether this was politics or ideology or just business is because of the second Wall Street Journal story, which really, takes this story backwards till really unto the 2014 elections. And so, therefore, when you look at some of the comments Ankhidas makes in that story, or is quoted as saying in that story, which is that, this is a man whose time has come, that it's taken 30 years to get rid of India's socialism, and so on and so forth. And, of course, her own links in her family to the BJP and the Sangh Parivar. That's where the doubt stems from, which is that was this just about pure play business, as in did Facebook see an opportunity in the BJP and Narendra Modi, or was Ankhidas really piggybacking on the Facebook bandwagon to deliver what was really ideological for her?
I don't rule out the second part of your question, Krishna. I mean, I don't rule out the fact that Ankhidas might have seen, this to be, a very good opportunity for her to further on her own ideology and her own ideological slant. But at the same time, as I said, these corporations, operate especially in their biggest market, right, Krishna? I mean, India is also the biggest market for Facebook. It's also the biggest market for WhatsApp, and one of the biggest markets for Instagram, right? So I'm fairly certain that they would have invested a lot of time and effort in trying to cement and solidify their business interests in this country. So that also can be from the political perspective, right? In 2012, 2013, when we, when these campaigns of Narendra Modi and the BJP did start taking, a certain solid shape, I'm very certain that Facebook would have sensed, as a lot of us did, that there might be a change in power, that there might be a new government and new regime in place after the 2014 elections. And I think these efforts were also, shaped up with the hope that you back the right horse in the race, right? So they did work with Narendra Modi, as the latest Wall Street Journal story says, in the campaigns, in the very initial campaigns. But I'm also, Krishna, fairly certain that they would have at that point also helped the Congress. I don't necessarily see them not helping the Congress. Maybe they wouldn't have done it to the extent that they did with Narendra Modi, for instance. And I think that's where the ideological slant comes into place, right? When you have in Mumbai, in India, when you have in India your top executive who's so closely aligned to the ruling dispensation, that she can influence decisions on so much of your working in that country, I'm guessing she would have had a certain role to play in ensuring that Facebook did what it could do in trying to back the BJP very early on in the race, not after they've come into government. And I think that's where it's a mix of Ankidas's own ideological slants, but also the company's very shrewd decision making, and sort of political crystal ball gazing of how things were going to shape up in India.
Yeah, of course, no one wants to give a certificate to the Congress, certainly not me and not now. But, the fact that several of the top Facebook India executives have also come from, Congress-leaning media organizations suggests to you that it's not just a BJP game here, but I think it's an equal opportunity game for all parties. But the point I'm trying to come to is this, which is that generally speaking, in the US, Facebook and Menlo Park, where it is located, is seen to be a den of liberals, quote unquote.
True.
Yet in country after country, Facebook seems to be doing business only with the hate speech mongers or the violence walas, be it Trump or Bolsonaro or whoever you can name. I mean, in the sense that although ostensibly Facebook is a liberal organization, it seems to be doing business with just the wrong kind of people all over the world.
Right. And I honestly think this is honestly capitalism at its lowest, or some would say at its finest, right? The ability to try and cull out commercial benefits no matter what the situation is, even if you are helping the aggressor, which Facebook is in so many instances, right from what's happening in the US to Brazil to what's happened in Myanmar in the past to what's happening in India right now. Facebook is on the wrong side of things consistently, but at the same time, Krishna, I mean, Facebook's also in the same period grown to be this behemoth of sorts, this massive company, which is one of the most powerful companies, and Mark Zuckerberg is now one of the most powerful individuals in the world. So it's not a coincidence that those two things have happened simultaneously, which is why I make my point that for Facebook, this is extremely shrewd business. This is extremely shrewd decision making. Where they're backing people who they know are powerful claimants to the seat, the seat of power in whatever country that they are, and they're backing that horse in lieu of the benefits that they could accrue. And we've seen that in the story that I did, for Article 14 last week, where Facebook is obviously, shielding the BJP. It's not taking action. But what has also happened is the BJP has emerged to be the biggest ad spender on Facebook India right now. So that there's one very direct sort of, financial benefit there. But let's also keep that aside, right, Krishna? I also saw some of the other ad spenders in the top 10 ad spenders on Facebook India. And four of them, so one of them is obviously the BJP itself officially. There are three others which are pages affiliated to the BJP, and together all of these four make up you're close to about 50 to 60% of the ad revenue that all the 10 spenders have spent on Facebook India. So these are an indicator of just how direct the commercial benefits can be, right? There's another aspect to this that I think is interesting to sort of weave into the conversation. Is the partnerships that Facebook India is now doing with the government of India at various levels. Again, this is something that my article spoke about, and I find it extremely interesting. Facebook is in tie-ups with right from the National Commission for Women to the Ministry of Home Affairs to the Ministry of Tribal Affairs, to also the CBSE. Now, it's making all of these partnerships where it might not necessarily gain monetary benefits out of, in the sense that maybe the argument can be that the government of India is not paying Facebook for a lot of this, but what Facebook is getting is it's getting access to the market that it's not been able to capture. And let me give you an example of this. The National Commission for Women, in the partnership with Facebook, has made Facebook the partner to train approximately 60,000 young women and girls across India, right? These are largely from colleges and universities, in different towns and cities of India. Now, what this does is, at a very early age, these girls will, be exposed to Facebook, will be exposed to Facebook's products, but they'll also be certified by the government of India as this being the right kind of exposure to them at that age, right? When you engage in a government training program where Facebook is training you on how to use the internet safely, obviously the brand recall that a company gets is massive in a circumstance like this. Which is why I make the point that Facebook is doing so much of what it's doing in as you say, backing the violence walas and the jhagda walas across the world, because it knows that these are the benefits that it can leverage out of, and it can accrue out of these partnerships and these relationships that it's developing with be it Narendra Modi in India, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Trump in the US. It knows what it can get out of it. It knows how to maximize the benefits of those relationships.
Yeah. So let's roll back just a bit. So essentially, you're saying that Anki Das was not doing what she's been alleged to have been doing by the Wall Street Journal and Time magazine. She was not doing it on her own. Perhaps headquarters knew that Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg perhaps waved this by. That's what you're saying?
So at this point, the best that we can do is try and analyze, what we know from what we know already. And one of the things that we know, which Facebook has not denied, by the way, is if you recall in the first Wall Street Journal story, Aki Das is supposed to have said that we should not be taking action against these four guys linked to the BJP because of because of the commercial interests involved for Facebook India in this case. Now, breaking it down, what it means is that she's not necessarily making the ideological argument, and I'm fully aware that she can't officially possibly also do that. But the fact that Facebook let that pass and Facebook agreed to her means somewhere that Facebook is acutely aware of its own financial interests involved, and the fact that its financial interests lay in being on the right side of the BJP and in being on the right side of the Narendra Modi government. So I don't hold a brief for Anki Das. I've never spoken to her in my life, but the fact remains that the fact is she's been allowed to do this in a multinational corporation. And my response to that is the buck should not end at Anki Das. Had she been in Mark Zuckerberg's chair, I would say the buck would end with her. But if if she's just one, cog in the wheel of Facebook, then I think it might be, slightly missing the point if we are only targeting her or only looking at her role. I think it's interesting, and I think it's very critical to look at the role of these corporations and these social media platforms in normalizing the kind of hate that we're seeing on Facebook, and also in gaining financial benefits from it.
Why do you think Wall Street Journal has done these stories at this juncture? I know that the US 2020 elections are just 2-3 months away. Is that the only reason, or is there any other reason you suspect as to why WSJ and then Time Magazine have done these stories?
I mean, I would only be able to speculate on the reasoning here, and one aspect is this, Krishna. I mean, India is obviously extremely high in terms of its demographic value to so many brands, to so many be it media organizations, be it social media platforms, and here a story about India, the kind that Wall Street Journal has been carrying. Firstly, let's be slightly skeptical, right? Let's look at it from a marketing perspective, not just purely an editorial perspective. A story like that is also allowing Wall Street Journal to gain the kind of exposure that it wouldn't otherwise in a country like India. It allows it to get eyeballs. It allows it to get a lot of publicity and a lot of action in terms of the fallout of its stories in India. That's one aspect of it. The other thing that I personally believe is that Facebook India's murky dealings are a story waiting to be tapped, Krishna. I mean, we were just discussing this. This is a story that has been waiting, that's been waiting to be told. There is, as I said, there is very little evidence that Facebook has been very prompt or very committed in cleaning up its platforms, especially in India. And if you go to see, Krishna, Facebook owns WhatsApp, and WhatsApp has been directly linked to so many different lynchings, to so many different hate crimes. I have done some reporting where I've seen how WhatsApp was weaponized, and as a result of that, communal riots have happened and people have been assaulted and sometimes even lynched. So you imagine the kind of baggage that this organization is now carrying in a country like India, right? And despite that, Krishna, Facebook has been allowed to get away for so long. Why is that? And what is this compact bind that is holding Facebook and the ruling BJP together? So I feel like journalistically, this is a Pandora's box that I would love to be opening. I would love to be reporting on this because I am certain there is so much more, so many more skeletons in this closet. So that's reason number 2. I mean, there is definitely a lot of stuff that has to be reported and should be reported when it comes to Facebook India. The third reason, and this is again me being slightly skeptical, is also Wall Street Journal and its ownership, right? It's owned by News Corp, and News Corp right now, and it's been for a while, in fact, been locked in this tussle with Facebook, globally, especially in the US, but especially also in Australia. Australia is seeing a very exciting and a very interesting case and a very interesting moment, actually, when we look at how journalism is going to shape up in the digital medium. And if you allow me a minute, I'd love to talk to your viewers about what is happening if they don't know already.
Sure.
So the Australian government is now firming up regulations, which would mean that Facebook and Google have to pay news publishers, if they have to allow news links to go onto their website. So very simply put, when you and me go onto Facebook, for instance, we see that, you posted a news story, I posted a news story, and lots of other people have, right? And over the last few years, we've seen how news consumption is increasingly, coming from social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter, for instance, where people don't want to go onto the home pages of news websites, but they want to go to these platforms and consume whatever news their friends have put up, right? So in this regard, what the Australian government has done is that it's saying that, listen, now that you are publishing all of this news, you are as good a publisher, or you're basically making use of these news articles on your website, and ensuring that people come to your website to read the news. And hence, in this argument, you must pay the news organizations, because you're using their product and you're increasing your own brand's outreach, and you're increasing your own brand's reach among people, right? And obviously, Facebook has not liked this argument one bit, as one would imagine. Facebook has very openly said that it would ban all news content on its platforms if the regulations were to be approved and if the regulations are made mandatory. One of the big players in the Australian media market is also News Corp. Recently it's actually shut down many local papers because of the pandemic and because of the financial crises that so many of them are facing across the world. So I am also, again, this is as I said, this is, one can only speculate, but this is also an interesting factor, and an interesting history behind Facebook and News Corp.
No, I am all for these stories to come out, frankly. But why I'm surprised is because Wall Street Journal and News Corp and Murdoch are really on the other side of the fence, frankly, in just philosophical terms. So for them to do these stories, and especially when Murdoch's men in India are themselves doing a very fine job of paving the way for the BJP, I find it surprising that Wall Street Journal should be doing these stories. So that's the simple point I was trying to make.
True.
But Kunal, let me come to this point, which is that it's now very obvious that these stories in the Wall Street Journal and Time Magazine have only basically scratched the surface, as far as I'm concerned, of what Facebook and even other social media platforms. I don't think it's just about Facebook, but let's just concentrate on Facebook. So I think these revelations have not gone beyond the surface as we speak. I want to know from your own work, what is it that we still do not know? What is the worst suspicion in your mind about what these platforms are doing? I know we are in speculatory ground here, but still, let's go and stick our necks out.
I think, Krishna, one of the things that, the Wall Street Journal stories and some of my own reporting points to, and which deserves immense level of scrutiny, is just how deep these ties are, right? How deep these ties are, I mean by, the ties between Facebook India especially and the BJP, and in effect the ruling Narendra Modi government. What we at this point know is as you said, I think we've only been able to sort of scratch the surface and only been able to establish some broad connections between the two. And also possible reasons why Facebook might want to protect its partnership with the BJP. What we don't know is whether and how, if at all, have they really helped the BJP in mastering social media, right? I think very few people now even doubt the fact that the BJP is the most prolific user of social media in a country as big as India. In fact, I sometimes joke about how some of its digital media campaigns, some of its social media, stories and the stuff that it does might put some of the best social media managers in the country to shame. For the sheer effort that they make and for the narrative that they do very successfully manage to stitch each and every time, right? no matter what the situation is, I think social media is the place where they try and turn around, the facts on the ground, and try and create a parallel narrative, which helps them immensely when it comes to beating back criticism. So this is the context of just why Facebook is essential to the BJP, is essential to the Narendra Modi government. I mean, let's not have any doubts that any of the, I mean, not many, but not many of the mainstream media organizations in India would even be willing to prick the narrative that the BJP sets. I mean, we know that they don't do that actively. But here is the BJP's chance. What social media does is that it gives players like the BJP and like all other parties, if they were to use it, but to set their own narrative in a slight bubble of sorts, right? I mean, for instance, if you're a BJP supporter, there's every chance, and if you're someone who's very passionate about the BJP, there's every chance that your Facebook will consist of pages which are affiliated to the BJP, pages which are supportive of the BJP, and pages run by the BJP themselves, right? There's also many chances that you will have a lot of friends who are BJP supporters and who will possibly also be in a similar bubble when it comes to their social media profiles, right? What Facebook and what platforms like Facebook do is allow players like the BJP to exploit this bubble completely. To give you an example, some of the content, some of the pages that I very regularly follow are run by affiliates of the BJP, or run by supporters of the BJP. And I often see that, for instance, I'll give you an instance of this. When the GDP figures came out, the GDP figures obviously came out and they were quite damning, right? They were minus 24%. Is a massive shock to the economy. Now, what social media does is that it allows the BJP to actually filter out all of this. It allows the BJP to set its own narratives. So on that day, what I did notice was that many pages affiliated to the BJP had obviously no sign of this news at all, but instead had other, news instances, had other incidents being put up and being shared as if they were the news of the day. And much of this is obviously stuff which will draw the outrage of its supporters, which will get them in a tizzy, which will get them angry. So it's a very clever way of ensuring that the news media doesn't set the agenda when it comes to this conversation between the party and its supporters, but the party can, in an unfiltered, unregulated, unchecked manner, set the agenda very consistently and ensure that its supporters remain in this bubble. So that is why Facebook is very crucial. And I think, just to quickly answer your question again, I think it's this that we need to unravel, if there is, as to how did Facebook allow the BJP to gain such a presence. And when I say allow, I mean that I'm fairly certain that Facebook has been open about the fact that it does assist, it does it calls them partners, it does assist partners in getting better about their presence on their platforms, right? So I'm fairly certain that the BJP would have been helped in some measure or the other to understand the platform better and to get better and better at it. But I want to see the extent of what that assistance was, and whether that assistance was also provided to the Congress or to the Aam Aadmi Party, for instance. And I'm fairly certain that the answer to the second question that I ask is a big no. I don't think that the Congress and the Aam Aadmi Party and many others have received the same level of support and hand-holding from Facebook as BJP has.
So essentially you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong, that outside of Facebook doing these deals with BJP for business prospects, as Ankhi put it, fearing a political fallout, as she put it, what you're saying essentially is that Facebook may have well tailored the algorithms for the BJP. That's what it means at the end of the day.
I don't necessarily mean Facebook might have altered or tailored the algorithms, as much as I mean that Facebook might have lent a better understanding of how to beat or how to master the algorithm game. If you understand what I mean. I think very few people understand the platform very well, and that inhibits the rise of people's social media presence. And by people I mean parties, organizations, companies, all of them running their own pages. What mystifies a lot of people is just how these algorithms work and what works and what doesn't, right? And I feel like here is an instance where I am fairly certain that the BJP has been given a better understanding of how to maximize their presence and how to work their way around the algorithms. And one can only speculate and try and understand and try and investigate. In fact, this is a matter of investigation for me and for all the journalists who are looking at this right now, is to see whether there was any insider help, as you said, to the BJP to try and tailor the algorithms in the favor of the BJP. Because if that has indeed happened, that is extremely serious and can be quite damaging to Facebook, and its credibility.
No, it's a good point you make, because I've had a conversation with Shobhan Saxena, who lives in Brazil, in Sao Paulo, and there is a podcast available on JPod with Shobhan Saxena, where he talks of very similar techniques and methods being employed by Bolsonaro in Brazil, to very similar ends, where outrage is rewarded, offense is rewarded, where hatred and poison and violence is easily spread. So what you see both in Brazil and India is not at all different. In fact, and Shobhan Saxena put a word to it. He said, what you see is the Steve Bannon playbook at work.
True.
And Steve Bannon, being who he is,
True,
makes a lot of sense to me at this juncture. But so we can keep talking about this, because these algorithms are, even from the accounts of Facebook insiders, designed to reward offense and hatred and
True,
outrage and so on. So we know some of these things, but we can keep talking about it. Let's come to a couple of more core questions here. Kunal, you yourself have done two pieces, at least two very standout pieces so far on this issue. One for the Wire last year, and another for the new portal Article 14.
right.
Why do you think mainstream media has been so reluctant to address the elephant in the room? Even now as we speak on September 2nd, 15 days after the Wall Street Journal reports, about the only story that has thrown any new light on this issue is the Indian Express, where Karishma Mehrotra revealed how BJP asked Facebook to relist pages that were connected to the fake news website Postcard. So outside of this, we have seen nothing at all. Why do you think mainstream media is so reluctant to deal with this issue?
I think there's a multifold answer to this, Krishna. One aspect is obviously we know the state of the mainstream media right now in India. We know that it doesn't remain the credible force of journalism that it did till a few years at least. And you would know this better than I do, with your vast experience in the media here. We know that the media has very deliberately not wanted to prod into issues which might be an embarrassment to the ruling BJP, or which might indict the ruling BJP or its members in any sort of an embarrassing position. And this is not just about Facebook. This can be so many different things, right? Right from sharper reporting of the government to sharper reporting of policy in New Delhi to the implementation of its various promises, etc., and so on. So there's one aspect, which is that the media itself is not in a shape where it wants to proactively look at these issues. There's also a second issue which I find interesting, and this is purely based on my conversations with journalists across newsrooms. I unfortunately don't have enough to substantiate my claims, but I definitely have enough to, make this claim that Facebook has also, has created a very interesting network of partnerships with various media organizations. So it funds various media organizations, and this funding is often done, to train journalists, to train the newsroom, in making use of Facebook better and getting better at the online and at the digital game, for instance. So there's one aspect is that Facebook has also been the sponsor for a lot of media events across board in different newsrooms. Um, Now, this and Krishna again, this is for me. This sounds like the classic newsroom advertiser conundrum, right? If there is an advertiser who is going to patronize you, who is going to fund you, and fund you quite generously, would you be willing to write against that organization? Would you be willing to stick your neck out and not just report against the organization, but also report against the BJP, which anyway most people don't. So I think there are these couple of issues that have come together. The third issue, Krishna, and I think this is also extremely crucial, is just the level of transparency when it comes to Facebook. It is so opaque to get information from Facebook. It is extremely difficult to try and engage with Facebook and understand it better. So for instance, the investigation that you mentioned that I did for Article 14, I found very clear evidence of the fact that Facebook took action against 700 odd pages on April 1 last year, and 687 of these pages belonged or were linked to the Congress, but none was linked to the BJP. And this action was taken because they have a criteria called coordinated inauthentic behavior, where pages and individuals are supposed to represent themselves fully, which means that if they are affiliated to organizations, they must make it clear and not misrepresent themselves as being independent, right? By the same criteria, I found at least 5 pages, 3 of which were run from the BJP's headquarters, according to the information that they themselves provided to Facebook. 3 of them were run from the BJP headquarters, and 2 of them were run by members of the BJP and were extremely, sort of sharp in spreading party propaganda. Now, none of these pages faced any action, whereas 687 pages, which belonged to the Congress or were linked to the Congress, faced the axe, and they were all banned from the platform. Now, even for a story like this, Facebook, despite me trying for 3 days, did not respond at all. So I neither got even a custom statement. I did not even get a custom statement. I did not get even a background briefing of how things are, which is what a lot of organizations often do if they don't want to be seen on record, telling people what has really happened or what their stance is. So Facebook has been extremely opaque in its functioning. Facebook does have conversations with journalists, but a very select group of journalists, who are reporting on policy, who are based mostly out of New Delhi, who are those, that cozy circle that Facebook many organizations often cultivate. So the third aspect is that it's extremely difficult to get data around Facebook's activities, and it's extremely difficult to, have enough and clinching evidence of Facebook's complicity or Facebook's lack of action against one party or another. So I think it's a combination of all of these 3 factors that has resulted in this story not getting the attention that it deserves.
No, you should not be surprised that Facebook did not respond to you, because Facebook did not respond to Wall Street Journal either. I think the only person who responded to Wall
But
Street
Facebook
Journal
did confirm to them, that the action was put off, and there was a statement in the first story at least. So,
yes,
the fact
that
is...
was not from India.
Yeah, that is not from India, exactly. So, the fact remains that Facebook obviously is extreme. I mean, they've even responded to the story that appeared in the Indian Express yesterday. So they have issued some sort of a statement. So Facebook obviously is extremely selective about who it wants to talk to, and which journalists it wants to build relationships with, which is absolutely fine, which is their prerogative. But what happens as a result is that it hinders a better understanding of Facebook by various people across the country, who are researchers, who are journalists, who are academics, who want to understand the network better, and that's not really happening at this point.
So essentially what you're saying is that through these sponsorships and partnerships of events and shows and this and that and the other, by picking up young interns and so on and so forth, Facebook has essentially bought the silence of the media, is the net conclusion, right?
I mean, knowing how our media operates and knowing what we've seen of the media, especially in the last 6 years, I'm not surprised that the media is silent, and I'm not surprised that the media is extremely reluctant to talk about this. Talk about this beyond doing a follow up of the Wall Street Journal story, or doing a follow up of our story on Article 14. The media doesn't seem very keen to be doing fresh breaking ground journalism. That doesn't seem to be happening at all.
What are 2 or 3 possible angles you would suggest to young journalists? I don't want to look very bleak and sound very dark about this, but I presume that there are still some young reporters who are tickled by this story enough to want to dig into this. What are 2 or 3 possible angles that strike you that young fellows could be looking at?
I think one, Krishna, is something that a lot of people can do, and I would urge and I would seriously recommend that journalists who are looking at understanding tech and understanding how social media platforms are operating, they must try and go out and try and follow as many pages as they can, which run party propaganda, not just for the BJP but also for the Congress, right? The reason why I say this is that because I think a lot of the people who are on these pages, because of the way our world is now shaping up, we are not being able to access the thoughts and the activities, and the understanding of a lot of these people. So the world that I see sitting here in Bombay vis-a-vis the world that someone who's sitting in a Raipur, for instance, or a Bhilai is seeing are extremely different. And I think I can't emphasize this enough, especially for young journalists. At least till we were sort of growing up, until we were in college, and till we became journalists, there were none of these social media platforms, which kept us in this bubble that we are now in, consciously at all times, right? Where we are only looking at a certain lifestyle, where we are only looking at a certain social setup that is propagated by our friends and our families on our feeds. But what we are not seeing is what's happening inside those pages that I mentioned. And the reason why I say this in response to your question, Krishna, is that one very easy test that a lot of journalists can administer to Facebook is just see the kind of content that's appearing on these Facebook pages, right, or these Facebook groups, and try and report this content, and see what comes of it. I mean, if you find that the content is xenophobic, if you find that the content is stoking anger and hatred towards minorities, for instance, or if it is spreading disinformation, try and report this content and maybe give it 10 days and see what happens. So that's something that can be done at a very, very accessible level for a lot of young journalists. And the results of that will not be surprising at all, but you'll at least get a window into how Facebook thinks and how Facebook acts. So that's the first thing that I would try and get young journalists to do, which is try and infiltrate these pages and try and understand them better and try and report content if you find that there is something at all that's happening. The other is, again, try and look at the data that we already have on in public domain. So for instance, as I said, Facebook doesn't give out too much data on its own, but but because of the criticism over years, it has now slowly started trickling some bits of data out. For instance, the ad spend report that I accessed, it's in one hidden part of Facebook India's website, right? It's about finding that. It's not very difficult to find it, but try and identify who are the advertisers. Try and identify what the patterns of advertising are. Who are the biggest players. Who are the more surprising players. So that's the other aspect that you can definitely do. And the third is try and identify ownership patterns within Facebook networks. So some of the pages that are being run, for instance, the 3 pages that I mentioned, Krishna. Now my first vote for Modi is one page. Bharat Ke Man Ki Baat is the second page, and Nation with Namo, that's the third page. Now all of these 3 pages, turns out, were being run from the BJP headquarters. While they don't talk of any affiliations to the party at all in the paid description. So my third suggestion would be try and identify these patterns. try and identify who is running these pages, who is maintaining this social media presence on behalf of whom. It could be the BJP, which it mostly is likely to be, but I'm sure there might also be some surprising answers where you find that pages are being run in favor of the Aam Aadmi Party, for instance, but are not being officially run by them. So there's also a lot of this information that is on Facebook, and that is something that you can access, if you are willing to. So I would say young journalists must try and get out and try and find as much as they can from the information that is already up, and let them lead them to the next steps of their investigations.
And also perhaps send up a small prayer that their editors and publishers will allow this to be published.
I think they should start the investigation with a prayer.
Yeah. Kunal, after all these revelations, and I don't know if they are revelations or just insinuations at this point of time, but after what we now know, is it fair to suspect Facebook for almost everything it has done in India so far?
Like what are you thinking of, Krishna?
Let me just draw your attention to its alliance with the Election Commission before the 2019 elections to create voter awareness.
Right.
This was something that happened. Then there was some pushback. Then there was some opposition to Facebook tying up. And then clearly something happened and Facebook was allowed to be part of this Election Commission campaign to create voter awareness. You see, these are the stories which really are problematic for me, in the sense of, it's very obvious now that we know what we know through Wall Street Journal, etc., that here is a social media platform which is doing business on the one side with a major political party, and on the other hand is also involved in the process of elections with the Election Commission. So I find these are very slippery slopes, in a manner of speaking. So I mean to ask this of you, which is that should we start suspecting some of these things too?
One of the things that we must definitely also at this point start looking at way more seriously than we have is partnerships like those, precisely the one that you mentioned, right? Facebook had also done a similar partnership before the 2017 Vidhan Sabha, state assembly polls across the country, where it tied up with the Election Commission, ostensibly to give out information around voter awareness, do voting, pledge voting drives, etc., etc. The point is this: knowing what we know of how Facebook operates, and I would say its very dodgy standards of data privacy, I think we must start looking at these exercises with extreme caution and a heavy dose of skepticism. The reason is this: Facebook is not a philanthropical organization. It's not into philanthropy. It doesn't, it's not here to make the world a better place. It's here to connect the world so that it can get advertisers and it can make its money. It's as simple as that. So it's high time that we start learning and understanding and reiterating this fact about Facebook over and over again. What we must try and do is try and understand how are those partnerships beneficial to Facebook, and what Facebook could gain out of those partnerships, and then try and evaluate those partnerships accordingly. So I would in retrospect, I would look at that 2017 partnership as well very closely, and see what happened there. Whether there was anything that flouted the laws, whether there was anything that could have also been improper, even if it's not illegal. Was there also anything improper, like a lot of people have alleged? So we must definitely start looking at these with a heavy dose of skepticism. And the reason why I tell you is this. For instance, in one of the examples that I mentioned, Krishna, in my piece in Article 14, I mentioned a very interesting experiment done by the Ministry of Women and Child Development when Menaka Gandhi was running it. This is way back in 2015, maybe a year after the Narendra Modi government came into power. One of the things that they did was it ran an initiative called 100 Women Initiative, right? The idea was very simple, that people must nominate women that they know, who are excellent torch bearers of of professionalism, of doing what they are doing in their spheres, of being excellent in various roles that they've played. So they could be anyone from artisans to business women, and so on and so forth. Now it seemed like a very benign campaign, which was a very feel good campaign, except that the fine print was this. The fine print was that the ministry tied up with Facebook on this, and the ministry made rules that everyone who wanted to nominate one candidate or one woman for the 100 women initiative had to be on Facebook and had to send a video to the Facebook page of the ministry, right? What this does is the implicit assumption that all the 101.3 billion people of India are on Facebook. We are not. So what it does is basically entices you to come onto Facebook and log onto Facebook, create an account, and sort of join Facebook and get connected with the platform. While so for Facebook that's a massive help. It's getting to tie up with the government. The government is in some ways certifying for Facebook, and the government is enticing people to join Facebook. So that was run exclusively on on the Facebook platform, and things like this, I feel like we must start sort of understanding and dissecting much more seriously than we have in the past. I mean, I saw some reports from back then where the reports, as you might have imagined, were very, very anodyne reports with very flowery language about how these women are excellent entrepreneurs and so on and so forth, and have been selected, and just the last few lines said that this was the process by which they were selected. Whereas I feel like the process could have made for a story in itself, looking back now.
Derek O'Brien of the Trinamool Congress, the former quizmaster and parliamentarian, Derek O'Brien said in the Rajya Sabha last year, in fact, I think June last year, that Facebook's Delhi office was virtually an extended BJP IT cell. He was, of course, quoting from a book by Cyril Sam and Paranjoy Guha Thakurta. But I noticed that one of his party colleagues, Mahua Maitra, made a similar point as what you are now doing, which is that she was taken to a workshop being organized for women MPs of the Lok Sabha, and it turned out that it was being organized by Facebook.
Absolutely, and I think that itself is Mahua Moitra's allegations that foreign entities are not supposed to be inside of Parliament. They are not supposed to be given access to the data of members of Parliament, and the fact that all of these norms were flouted is quite serious and is quite damaging. I mean, the fact that they could do this in Parliament and then also get away with this. And sadly, Mahua Moitra at that point did not, or at least I don't remember reading about this at that point when this happened. So, things like these have to be, reported much more closely and much more seriously, I would say. And I think the responsibility falls on each one of us, journalists who are following this story, to try and catch these patterns and to try and scrutinize these partnerships very, very closely. Because, Krishna, what these partnerships also do, and I think it's very important to understand this here, these partnerships not just allow Facebook to expand its reach, but they tie in Facebook much more closely with the ruling party and the establishment than it would have liked. The problem that I have with such a compact bind between the two is that Facebook, in its role as a social media conglomerate, a behemoth in some ways, is supposed to be actually monitoring and regulating the content that comes up on its platforms. And the BJP, as we now know, is one of the biggest players of its platforms. It's the biggest advertiser. So when you're in such a cozy relationship with your biggest advertiser, how are you? Are you going to be fair? Are you, can we expect you to be fair? The answer is that you're not fair, and we have enough evidence of that. So I find that this conflict of interest is extremely damaging, but it's also extremely interesting for us journalists to now pursue and try and unravel better.
In fact, I would take it one step forward, because all these all this talk of partnerships and sponsorships and all of or whatever nomenclature they give this is a loose change for a company like Facebook. To me, the question is, how did you zero in on Facebook to train women in these? Was there a bidding process? How did the Women and Child Welfare Department get Facebook onto this? Was there a bidding process? You see, this can't just be such a monopolistic exercise that Facebook walks away with all the contracts. So therefore, to
Absolutely.
me, these processes are very important. How did they choose Facebook? What is its expertise in delivering these deliverables?
Absolutely. I mean, the fact that it happily gets. I mean, I don't want to call it a contract because I don't know if there was a contract involved, but it gets the license to train 60,000 women across the country, for instance, or it gets the license as it recently did, from the Tribal Affairs Ministry. It has now entered a partnership where it trains 5,000 tribal students across tribal regions in India. I mean, how is Facebook being allowed to do this? And let's say, not organizations who are working on the ground in those areas, right? As you said rightly, I mean, these processes are so important to understand for journalists because these partnerships, these relationships should not be treated as a benign philanthropic activity, which so far I sort of hold myself guilty of that as well. But we've so far treated all of these activities as to be very, very philanthropic, thinking that Facebook is here to do good and, it's trying to do its bit of social responsibility by taking up these things. But the problem is if these partnerships are what keeps its record of normalizing hate going on, then we must all wake up to this and we must all try and act against it, especially as journalists report more closely about these.
What we now know through these reports from the foreign media outlets, was this just this collaboration between Facebook and BJP? Do you think it was just about the 2019 elections, or did it go way back into 2014 and everything in between?
I don't even have to speculate here, but there is an article by Anki Das written just after the 2014 elections, where she has spoken about how the Narendra Modi campaign utilized Facebook very well, and that helped them win more votes. So it's not even me or you or our word which is to be taken where we say that Facebook was extremely crucial for the victory of the Narendra Modi government, for the victory of the Narendra Modi campaign at that point. But it's Facebook itself which is saying that. So, Krishna, I have little doubt that this is gone way beyond 2014 as well. My suspicion is that this is slightly before that, because the campaign of what we now know, at least, had started work at least a couple of years before, the Narendra Modi campaign. And Narendra Modi has always sought to portray this image that he's extremely tech savvy and he's extremely on top of all things technology. And Facebook has been a very big part of his campaign in reaching out to younger voters. So he's done Facebook exclusive events on his campaign trail. He's obviously, his campaign has been tailored to suit the users of Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and all of these platforms. So I have very little doubt that Facebook's role in this whole thing has gone beyond 2014. We just don't know if Facebook's role was was lopsided in the way that it helped this campaign much more than it would have helped the Congress and the Aam Aadmi Party at that point, or whether there was equal amount of help at least till that point. That's something that deserves another journalistic investigation, I would feel.
Well, actually, the reaction of one of the BJP members who sits on the IT standing committee is quite revealing as to what the collaboration could have been and how long back it went. Nishikant Dubey is who I'm talking about.
Right.
The efforts he made to stall the IT standing committee
Absolutely.
from taking up this issue reveals a lot.
Absolutely. And in fact, that's one point that I've also been making, and I recently sort of tweeted about it as well, is that, Krishna, world over, we're seeing this happen where, we're seeing this in Australia now, we're seeing this in the UK for a while, we've seen this in the US, where different governments and also obviously the European Union, where different governments are wanting to bring Facebook to task. Different assemblies, different parliaments are trying their best to try and get a better sense of how Facebook operates, and the damaging effects that it might be causing to their country. But we're in India, where we've clearly seen, for instance, how WhatsApp, for instance, has played a very direct role. And WhatsApp has been weaponized by people who were involved in hate crimes to conduct those hate crimes. We've also seen how Facebook has normalized hate, and yet we have the ruling government, which doesn't seem very interested in bringing Facebook to task. I mean, as you said, I found Nishikant Dubey's um, outrage at Facebook being summoned in a committee that he's a part of. I found it hilarious, to be honest, because I mean, is the bond so much more brazen now that you have to go all out and stick your neck out, stick your political credibility out, and say, I will not allow Facebook to be summoned? Or should you not, as a right-thinking member of parliament of this country, say, these investigations are damaging enough? I would much rather, even if I feel Facebook might not be involved, I would much rather get an investigation done and come to the truth of it. So I think unfortunately we've reached a point where the government and the ruling party are both very, very conscious about their support for Facebook, and they're very open. And I don't know if you've seen the letter written by the Minister of IT, Ravi Shankar Prasad, to Mark Zuckerberg yesterday, where he's obviously tried to turn things around and say that Facebook has a bias against the BJP. And I find this is interesting because BJP is clearly now trying to turn the screws on the opposition. And as I said, it's trying to turn the narrative on its head, where it's saying that the bias is not towards us, but it's against us. To get their supporters all riled up and try and distract us from the issues. So that's interesting. I mean, I find it quite hilarious, to be honest, and also quite
Actually,
undermining.
that's quite the same argument in the US too, which is that, although Facebook is seen to be full of engineers who are liberal and who do and say all the right things, Facebook generally in the US faces a which people like Donald Trump and Steve Bannon have exploited. And in fact, many people believe that the kind of license that right-wing loonies in the US have got, QAnons and so on and so forth, is also a bit of a pushback or a bit of leeway given by Facebook, in the face of criticism that it is facing in the US. So I'm not surprised that Ravi Shankar Prasad is making that, except that it sounds so hilarious.
True.
That the minister should be talking of what he's talking. Let's not forget that Narendra Modi himself asked prospective BJP MPs to get 3 lakh genuine, quote-unquote, genuine Facebook likes in 2018.
True.
In the backdrop of what we now know, was this exhortation by Mr. Modi just a recognition of Facebook's reach, or was this deft use of the platform, or did he know something more than what he told us back then?
Krishna, I think it's a mix of all of the three. I think it's a very candid admission of just how critical Facebook is to the campaign, especially to the BJP campaign, and it's also a recognition of the party's own machinery when it comes to canvassing online, right? We've seen various parties try and do it. The Aam Aadmi Party does it. The Congress also does it. And the Shiv Sena has been doing it. In fact, if you go to see the ad spend reports, you'll find a number of political parties are doing it now. They're placing ads on Facebook, etc. So there is obviously that sense that Facebook is crucial to the campaign, but the BJP's own role in ensuring that the campaign goes off so smoothly, and the infrastructure that it has created over years, the pages that it has, the pages that it doesn't disclose it has, the pages run by affiliates, the pages that are meant to look independent, all of these put together, BJP has an amazing arsenal for a digital campaign in a country like India. So I mean, Narendra Modi's statement asking people to get more followers on Facebook is also just aligning the party's strengths on campaigning digitally with the party's aspirations of reaching more and more people. But having said that, I mean, this goes hand in hand with the fact that they know that getting people onto Facebook allows them to, to spread the kind of content, to spread the kind of propaganda that they wish to, without as much of a check by Facebook. And I think that in some ways is symbolic of the fact that the ruling party is extremely keen on joining more and more people onto, their official pages on Facebook, and is clearly doing all of these partnerships so that Facebook's reach widens even more.
Well, so far all the attention has been on Facebook. But do you think they're alone in the grand project, or do you suspect that other players like Google and Twitter and YouTube are also part of this? Looking at the manner in which some accounts are deleted, some are retained, etc., etc. Do you think some of these other tech platforms are also into this, but they have not got the same kind of scrutiny as Facebook?
So, Krishna, I have been trying to expand my own work, and understand better how the other platforms have been utilized. And I recently, in fact, last week, I wrote a story for the Foreign Policy, where I basically looked at how, there is a new subgenre of content on YouTube, which is basically angry nationalistic, rants by young men, and they're generally sort of a very abusive rants, where they are taking on people who are, quote unquote, the enemies of the nation, without really, professing their support for the BJP. But again, they don't need to do that if they're already doing, so much of it, right? So the idea is that, you have people like these on Facebook as well, who become influencers in their own rights, and who are very, very much in tune with the BJP's hardline nationalistic agenda. So it's, what is interesting to see is the BJP, and obviously other parties, but the BJP more so, realizes how all of these platforms have to be used differently. You cannot have the same strategy for everything, So Facebook has a certain kind of use by the BJP in its affiliated pages, but YouTube, for instance, when I did this story, I found that all of these guys, Krishna, had like, followers in hundreds of thousands of young men and some women possibly, who are following these people. These people go out and do meetups, and where they go and meet their fans offline. So there is a different world out there, especially on YouTube as well, and in some ways on Instagram, but Instagram not as much as Facebook and YouTube. So all of these platforms have been weaponized in some form or the other. It's about us journalists trying to tell the story as honestly and as diligently as we can. Unless we try and break this down, and unless we try and dissect how all of these platforms have been weaponized, and have been used, to further hate and propaganda, I don't think much of this will be unraveled. Instead, what we'll see, as I saw on YouTube, is all of these influencers getting a free hand, creating accounts, having thousands and sometimes even millions of followers online, and influencing people in their own ways, to push them closer to the BJP's agenda. So it's you have to see it closely and understand how every platform is being used differently and not the same style.
Do you foresee a day when Mark Zuckerberg or Sundar Pichai or any of these tech major CEOs will sit in front of in Parliament and answer a set of questions from the Standing Committee or from parliamentarians generally? Do you foresee that day, or do you think this will just be confined to the US?
I mean, seeing the way how our parliamentary committees, even the intention to summon Facebook officials has been met with so much of resistance from, the ruling party and the government itself in some ways. I don't know if that will be possible anytime soon. But again, the problem is this, right? The fact that Ravi Shankar Prasad had to even write that letter yesterday, is showing very clearly that perception is gathering some ground, and that perception is quite damaging to the BJP. To correct that perception, I don't rule out the BJP wanting to go one up on Facebook. I mean, even in the past, we've seen, a couple of years ago, Anurag Mathur, he had summoned Facebook officials as well, where he had
Anurag Thakur.
yes.
Anurag Thakur.
So Anurag Thakur himself had also summoned. I think he was the Minister of IT, if I'm not wrong. He had summoned officials as well at that point. So, the fact remains that the BJP will do all it takes to try and gain ground of the perception. And if the perception demands that they show that they are acting tough on Facebook, then, I mean, who knows to what lens they can cope, right? But at this point, I don't see it working out just yet. Who knows,
So
it might work out in the future.
Therefore, Facebook's accountability and liability will end in Washington, D.C., but not stretch to Delhi in India.
I'm not very certain if it will stretch to Delhi, and the reason, as I've said, is the deep, and very sort of intimate ties that Facebook India has developed with the ruling establishment. It's in the US, Facebook has taken flack from both sides of the political aisle. They've taken flack from the president himself. We are here in a position where Facebook is still expanding its reach in India, and it can do with all the government support that it can get in India to do that. So I don't see Facebook wanting to jeopardize all of its business interests. And again, let's not forget that Facebook is not just Facebook alone, but it's also WhatsApp, which is now tied in with Reliance Jio. We also have Instagram. So we have all of these various properties of Facebook which are very, very keen on making a big splash. And we might also see WhatsApp money coming in. So I think the business interests are too high for them to antagonize the government here.
The defense scandals, whenever they take place in this country, and it's quite often, the defense scandals generally result in a rash of demands for a ban on lobbyists. After these Facebook revelations, Kunal, involving Anki Das, do you think the time has come for India to relook at this whole business of public policy? I mean, most of them are journalists. Most of them are generally now seen to be brokers greasing the system for their foreign owners. Do you think, like lobbyists, this whole business of public policy dudes needs a relook?
But the thing is, Krishna, I mean, I completely think that there is definitely a need for closer scrutiny. The problem is this, that there's a layer of hypocrisy here where we will, for all purposes, have lobbyists who will be roaming around in the corridors of power. But we officially do not recognize them as lobbyists, right? So we have things like public policy, we have things like government relations. These are fancy titles which more or less imply some sort of a lobbying role in all of these multinational corporations. I think what is needed, and I want to speak from a more journalistic point of view, because I think that's something that is within our reach, at least in some measure. Is try and interrogate these choices that multinational corporations especially are making in India when it comes to appointing their points persons. We have seen the reason why they appoint people they do. The reason that they do that is because they are seen to be closer to the ruling dispensation in whatever form, and they're seen to be able to curry favors with the ruling establishment, so that Facebook, or so that any other multinational corporation for that matter, does not have or does not land into trouble for whatever it does or doesn't do. The reason why I say we need to look at this closer is because that is where sometimes the story lies. The fact that an Anki Das with her background, the fact that Shivnath Thukral with his background, the fact that these guys are employed by Facebook, that tells you something at least. I mean, I must confess that it's not enough. The background is not enough for us to arrive at a judgment that they are biased. But it does tell you enough that we must look at their actions much more carefully to see if there is any degree of bias at all. So I feel like journalistically, I think we must embark upon this as an exercise where we scrutinize these points persons very, very closely. The sad part is, though, Krishna, that I know for a matter of fact that many big editors across India, especially New Delhi, many big journalists, many tech journalists are extremely close to these groups of people. One reason obviously is the partnerships that they have embarked upon with media organizations. The other is also just the close cozy comforts that they operate in, especially in a center like New Delhi. So I feel like somewhere that also is stopping us from investigating these links further. And that's where journalism, and especially young journalists who are listening to your podcast, must realize the responsibility that they have, which is to try and scrutinize and try and look at all of these developments carefully, and try and look at even the people and the faces behind these multinational corporations extremely carefully.
Well, one final question. After all that has now come out, after all that we now know, do you think Ankhidas will survive?
I mean, I feel like the answer to that is, of what value does of what value is she to Facebook? Is she so valuable that they can take the damage and the doubts over their credibility and their integrity in India and still retain her? One factor that Krishna will play a very important role in this whole saga, which we don't really know about, is what people inside Facebook have known of Ankhidas. And I must tell you that I'm sure people inside Facebook know a lot more about Ankhidas than you and me do, even with all of these investigations that have gone out, right? Having known what they do of an Anki Das or of some of our other colleagues, does Facebook still think it's a good idea to persist with them? That's for Facebook to answer. But what it will tell us is how high the bar for propriety and how high the bar for integrity has Facebook set for its own personnel, for its own officials. It will tell us a lot about that bar.
Well, that's Kunal Purohit, one of the few journalists who's kept a close eye on the role social media platforms like Facebook and WhatsApp are playing in coarsening India's politics. Thank you very much, Kunal, for joining me, and thank you all for listening in.
Thank you so much, Krishna. This has been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Human history has many examples of stalwarts who were accelerate in diverse areas, be it Aryabhat, Leonardo da Vinci. Human history has many examples of stalwarts who were accelerate in diverse areas, be it Aryabhat, Leonardo da Vinci.
The theme music for J-Pod was composed by me, Krishna Prasad, using GarageBand. You can follow Kunal Purohit on Twitter at Kunal Purohit, which is one word. And you can follow his work at kunalpurohit.com. Thank you very much for listening in.